All right, let's dive in here. We got Jeff, Drew, and any LG 5K displays at a good price on eBay now. Oh, dude, I'm seeing them all over the place. I saw a guy selling two LG 5K ultrafine displays. He wanted $1,500 for two of them. He had two of them, and they were like brand new condition. So if you're looking for a 5K display and you don't want to toss down the money for the Apple Studio display, which if you're paying $1,600 for it, I don't think that I would do that. Then I think you could get a great deal on an LG Ultrafine, because a lot of those guys who bought the LG Ultrafine, they're selling them now to buy the Apple Studio display. That's what it seems like to me. So I see them on Craigslist. I see them on Facebook Marketplace. I would probably defer to one of those two places rather than eBay, but they're also on eBay. So if you don't want to spend full price for the Studio display, that's the way to go, I think. And we could talk about the Studio display more, but yeah, we will. We'll talk about it later, because I'm about to get ahead of myself here again.
You can like lap yourself.
Hey, there I am. So let's talk about the M1 Ultra Mac Studio performance. So I'm not here to bag on the M1 Ultra Mac Studio, okay? I ordered one. It's just been charged to my credit card. I am genuinely excited for it, okay? I'm not here to just bag on it, but the truth of the matter is there have been a lot of benchmarks that have come out this week. A lot. People comparing the M1 Ultra to the M1 Max is a popular test. And there's one video in particular that I watched from Max Tech, the channel Max Tech, which I don't know if you ever watch Max Tech. He does a lot of benchmark stuff. And honestly, just to give some kudos to Max Tech, Max and Vadim, I don't think there's anyone that does better benchmarks than them right now. They really go in deep, and they benchmark the hell out of everything. And if you can see this frame from this video, you see his reaction to the M1 Ultra benchmarks. This kind of summarizes the sentiment at this current moment. And for those of you listening, Max Tech is sitting there with his hand on his face, and his face is like pointed downward. Some of these benchmarks have been confusing because they're just not as good as you would expect them to be. And Renee Ritchie did a video this morning talking about the same thing, how the benchmarks aren't as good as we were hoping they were going to be. And then basically he spends the first like 10 seconds of the video telling you that the benchmarks aren't great, they're not looking good. And then he literally spends like 8 minutes doing some mental judo to basically say, well, the benchmarks, no one cares about benchmarks. Come on, who cares about benchmarks? They're not important. People don't even understand them. I don't even understand them, so don't worry about those benchmarks. You'll be happy as long as you just ignore those darn benchmarks. It's going to be fun. Now, look, I'm just poking a little bit fun here, but I was watching the video. I was like, if I were in front of Renee having this conversation, I'd be like, Renee, really, is that really how you feel? Like, do you really think that benchmarks don't matter? I mean, they aren't the whole story. I will agree with him on that point. They are not the whole story. There's a lot of real world tests that are hard to measure because they are things that you do within your Final Cut Pro workflow or something. And there's no real good benchmarks to measure those specific things. But they do matter. They definitely matter. And they are a good indication of overall performance. And I think the confusing thing is there are benchmarks, and I'll go through some of these here in just a sec. Sorry for the preamble here. There are some benchmarks where the M1 Ultra does really well, but there's a lot of benchmarks where it doesn't. And my point is that you're spending $2,000 extra on an M1 Ultra. The advantages should be obvious. They should be jumping off the page and slapping you around like that, They shouldn't be hard to find. You shouldn't have to be nitpicking and looking through and trying to find the one place where the Ultra is better. Like, it's a $2,000 edition. The benchmark should be obvious. The real-world test should be crystal clear on how this is performing better than an M1 Max. And right now, the truth is they're not. In a lot of instances, the M1 Ultra is performing as good as the M1 Max, and in some cases, a little bit worse.
How can that be?
I know. Well, that's the question. And that's what we're going to talk about here in a second. So I'll point you to this this great benchmark and thermal video that Max Tech did, and I'm pulling out some of the observations that they had and some of my own observations looking or watching their video. And we'll just talk about benchmarks here just at a high level. Okay, I'm not going to go too in deep here. I'll let you go watch the video yourself. But this is the sentiment that you need to keep in mind. Okay, the M1 Ultra. So, in the one of the first observations I would make is like the Mac Studio. I think across the board, everyone's saying dead quiet. The thing just doesn't turn the fans on ever. Like you can barely ever hear it, which I think is an important feature because a lot of us don't like having noise when we're doing our editing and having the fans screaming. Also, the other thing, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the fans not coming on, is that the cores of the M1 Studio or the M1 Ultra don't actually get that hot. Like they hover between like 35 and 50 degrees Celsius, which if you ever built a PC, like an Intel PC, you know is like, that's like less than idle for an Intel CPU, right? Like an Intel CPU will get to be like 100 and 20 degrees Celsius under load and maybe 50 under idle. So that's really good. So let's talk about benchmarks now. So the M1 Ultra was about 70 to 75% faster than the M1 Max in the 3D Mark benchmark. Okay, so that's good. That's really good. That's probably about as good as I've seen from a benchmarks perspective. Like you would expect that the M1 Ultra would be twice as fast as the M1 Max because it's two M1 Maxes fused together. But from what I've seen, that never actually happens. Like the best that I've seen is it might be 70 to 80% better than one M1 Max, which is good, but it's not double the performance as you might expect. Okay, and one of the observations that Max Tech had was that it kind of seemed like throughout all these different tests, the M1 Ultra never really got, it never really was being maxed out, right? It always seemed like something was being held back. It wasn't getting as much wattage as it could have handled. And so it wasn't being utilized as much as you would think that it would be, which could be one of the reasons why the performance isn't as good as you would think it would be. So let's move on to Cinebench. In the Cinebench test, it performed very well, and actually it did beat a 3080 GPU by about 10% in that test, and it barely lost to the 3090, which I think is really impressive. So it's a super powerful GPU. It was also, not very hot the entire time. The fans didn't come on while this test was happening. So that's impressive. In the Blender test, this is where things kind of got weird, and there are other tests that I could talk about, which we don't have time to go into today, where these results are kind of similar. So in the Blender test, the M1 MacBook Pro, they were doing a GPU test, and it did the test in about 1 minute 52 seconds. And the Mac Studio did that same test in 1 minute and 18 seconds. So 1 minute and 52 seconds for the MacBook Pro with a, let's see here, what did it have? The M1 Max. And then 1 minute and 18 seconds for the Mac Studio. Now, Lewis, that seems like not a really big improvement to me. Wouldn't you agree? It's like, it's faster.
What is it, like maybe a fourth faster or something like that?
That's like 34 seconds faster. So, that's not nothing, but you would expect it to be a lot better for what the M1 Ultra is, right? It should be, you would think that it would be closer to like half the time, but it's not that much faster. That's troubling. I think that's troubling. Let's move on to Final Cut Pro. In the Final Cut Pro export test, the M1 or the M1 Max in the MacBook Pro did the export in about 1 minute and 22 seconds. And the M1 Ultra in the Mac Studio did the test in 1 minute and 17 seconds. So you get a 5-second improvement there. Now, that's just straight up weird, right?
Add all those 5 seconds together, pretty soon you got a minute.
Yeah, right. There you go. That's some optimism. Over the course of the year, you're going to save yourself 6 minutes, solid 6 minutes, if you're doing video work every single day. Now, it is worth noting that, and this could be part of the mystery of what's going on here, that not all the apps that are out there have been updated to take advantage of the M1 Ultra, right? That's a common sentiment that I have heard. And that initially makes sense until you think about the fact that, well, wait a second. The M1 Ultra was designed to be recognized as a single SoC, right, by applications. And the whole point of fusing the two M1 Maxes together in this way was that you wouldn't need to optimize, I thought. You wouldn't need to optimize your application to take advantage of the extra horsepower because the system does that for you, right? Like it's built into the M1 Ultra. It's just one chip to your system. And so for me, I'm confused. Why aren't all apps immediately able to take advantage of the power of the M1 Ultra? I don't understand that. Maybe there's someone out there that does. It doesn't make sense to me. It seems like we should be seeing really clear and obvious results from the M1 Ultra right off the bat, and then they should get even better if apps somehow optimize for the M1 Ultra. The other thing I would say is there is apparently a newer version of Final Cut Pro that Apple has been using for their benchmarks, and they include those benchmark scores on apple.com, but they haven't released it. So the current version is 10.6.1, which is like 4 or 5 months old, and Apple is using 10.6.2, which is a version that's not even out yet. So people are saying, oh, well, the reason we're not seeing crazy good Final Cut Pro performance is because 10.6.2 is not out. Maybe. But again, I go back to my original point. Wasn't the whole point of the M1 Ultra that systems saw that as one single SoC? You wouldn't have to optimize. So again, I'm confused. And back to Rene Ritchie. I mean, he was saying like, well, the benchmarks are confusing and they're hard to do, and people misunderstand them, and you really need an expert to interpret them. I think those are all valid points, but it shouldn't be this hard to interpret. You know what I mean? Like, like the benefits of the M1 Ultra should be readily apparent, I think, for all to see. You shouldn't need some mystic crystal ball reader to interpret the benchmark results for you. They should be obvious. You're paying an extra $2,000. I think that the benefits should be obvious. Are you with me so far here, Lewis?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought was it must just be that the software isn't quite, ready for it or whatever to take advantage of the full power. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I watched that whole video too, and honestly, just I couldn't even. I just don't care that much about benchmarks. I care, does the computer work and do what I need it to do. I find it shocking.
That was kind of Renee's point. I feel like that was Renee's point exactly. Like, don't worry about all those kooky benchmarks. Like, don't worry about those guys. Come on. No one cares about benchmarks. Like, I just thought he was being he was being acrobatic in his explanation, right? To justify the upsetting benchmark performance that we've seen so far. And by upsetting, I don't mean it's bad. I just mean it's not as good as we had hoped it would be for the amount of money that you're spending.
Well, and you said that some of the things were it actually performed worse on.
Yes.
What was that? What was that? Drop test? I mean, what was it?
They played kickball with it, right? So like they dropped it on their foot, kicked it, and then they did a
roll
soccer
pretty
match.
well.
I mean, there were tests, and I'm not completely shocked by that because in single core performance, in some tests, it doesn't do as well as the M1 Max, or they're really close, because the M1 Ultra, its power is its extra ProRes encoding engines, its extra cores, CPU cores, its extra GPU cores. So if you're just doing something that measures single core performance, then yeah, it's not going to win necessarily in those benchmarks because you're not taking full advantage of its benefits. And I get that. But there's a lot of those kinds of tests that it seems to not really do a whole lot better. So that begs the question, what is the M1 Ultra actually better at, right? Like what is the purpose of all that extra
Sapping
power?
your wallet.
Besides enriching Apple, yeah. You know what I mean? And again, I ordered one. I'm not like, abandoned ship, this thing. But I do wonder maybe, it seems as though most of us probably would be better off with the M1 Max. Unless you're doing something really specific that takes advantage of the M1 Ultra's power. But that kind of goes back to my question. What are those things, right? Like, in what areas would the M1 Ultra actually be completely utilized? If you're doing a lot of 8K content, that seems to be one of the areas. But if you're doing 4K content, it doesn't seem like you're actually gaining a whole lot by switching to the M1 Ultra. I don't know. I mean, that's why I'm buying one, so I can do the test myself. But it is surprising, right? Like it should have been in this first round of benchmarks. We were all like holding our breath and excited to see what happened. And then once we saw the results, it was like whoopee cushion. You know, it was like it was very deflating. It was like, wait a second, I spent $4,000, $5,000 on this machine. The machine that Max Tech was using was almost $6,000. And it's like, wait a second, like this isn't necessarily outperforming my MacBook Pro. Now that is a pickle, because that's a whole lot of extra money. And I know you like pickles.
I do like pickles.
I actually
pickles are delicious.
I also love pickles. Like, you know those big weird ones at the at the gas station,
the fluorescent ones,
like those fluorescent green ones are just floating around in that jar of urine. All right, let's see here. Let me see. Samuel Burka is saying, I think Apple's playing safe. The Mac Studio is going 60% of power. There has not been a Mac OS update since the Mac Studio. Well, that could be it. I mean, the answer might just be updates, right? We just need updates. But if that's true, then where are those updates? The Mac Studio has been out for a week, and there are no updates yet. And going back to what Tim Baker in the chat is saying is, the Vergecast was saying that the beauty of the M1 Ultra was that it didn't require apps to update to support it. Yeah, that's what my understanding is too. The whole point of the M1 Ultra was that your system sees it as one SoC. So why would apps have to update for it? That's the part that troubles me and makes me think that maybe we're not actually going to see significant performance increases going forward, even with updates. So I don't know. I'm just giving you guys the information. And this is the stuff that I think about because I'm plurking down my own money on this. And from my perspective, I'm like, well, if I didn't spend the extra money for the M1 Ultra, that pays for the Apple Studio Display, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So it's a lot of extra money. You know, $2,000 for the M1 Ultra is a lot of extra money. And if you're not going to get that much value out of it, then it's worth talking about because you might want to save yourself the extra money. I don't know. This is just all the stuff that I'm thinking about.